A manager in manufacturing, R&D and business development, and taking some quite novel technologies through to quite useful market applications. And creativity in science, of course, and engineering was quite important, but I often found actually creativity in management was also key to making it all happen if you really wanted to accelerate things through fast. And what I hope to do sometime during my presentation is to illustrate to this community there's never been such a fantastic opportunity for social scientists to engage with science technology and deliver something that perhaps could not be delivered without them. So if I leave you with one thought today, that is a thought that I leave you with, and hopefully I'll provide an argument to prove that. But of course, we're here for the STIR project. 6 years ago, two colleagues and I created an interdisciplinary institute in nanotechnology manufacturing to debottleneck and accelerate new science through to commercial and clinical application. And you will see with Paul's work, actually, we have created spin-outs from that work. You will see Paul's investigation of work in that in the domains of one of our spin-outs and research collaborators from there. Did you want to say a few words, Paul?
Yes, yeah. We better put this in the context of STIR.
Yes.
So my name's Paul Elwood. I'm one of the STIR students that was part of the initial cohort, and I sit here under the heading of management studies. I come from a business school, and we might explore what that means through this discussion. So I wanted to just frame, before Terry explains it, I just wanted to frame what we're going to say in terms of our wider set of interests and why we got involved in STIR. I should say one thing, just for the avoidance of doubt. Terry is not the lab manager with whom I interacted. Unfortunately, that guy was called away almost at the last minute on faculty business. He had to go to Malaysia. So Terry offered to step in at the last minute, because Terry is someone with whom we have collaborated on a range of projects, and he has experience in EC nanotech policy development that's relevant to STIR. So it was a more than able substitute. But let me just, before I hand over to Terry, just frame some of our wider interests in the business school and why we got interested in STIR. So where the two of the big questions we're addressing at the top there. So how is science-led innovation done? What are the practices associated with science-led innovation? Can we have a rich understanding of those? And how is knowledge about how to do science-led innovation generated and used and evolved by all actors? So those are the big questions, and you can see why we would be interested in being involved with STIR. So what Terry's going to speak first, and he's going to talk about some of his adventures in nanotech policy development in the European Commission and why he's connecting with management studies. And then I'm going to talk about one of the STIR studies I did as one of these integration scholars, in which I was interested in how some of these mandates for responsible innovation that Terry is going to talk about influence the practice within the research groups. So that's how we'll structure ourselves. So let me switch over to Terry's presentation and let him go.
Let's see if I can align myself. My voices hopefully will hold up from the cold. Right, we've had our introductions. Let's see if this works, yes. So this is what I'll talk about, EU nanotechnology research policy development, some progress of implementation of that policy in the current framework programme, which is 2006 to 2012, new challenges for management in industry. If you look at Framework 7, it's quite a large multi-billion programme. It has 9 cooperative themes. Number 8, you will see, is social, economic sciences and humanities. There are other schemes as well. Ideas as a European Research Council for supporting the superstars in European research and the future superstars of European research. And I can talk about that if you're interested. The People Programme, the Marie Curie Actions, is all about training of young researchers, training through research, interdisciplinary research, and moving them around Europe to do the kind of thing you've been doing in STIR. So there may be a future avenue which we could perhaps exploit in our transatlantic collaborations. Now, nanoscience and nanotechnologies figures primarily in Theme 4, which has €3.5 billion to spend in the 7-year programme. We've got 2 years to go, including this year. It also figures very highly in the IDEAS programme, the European Research Council. In fact, some cluster analysis I've done recently shows that in the engineering, physical sciences and industrial-related sciences, 75% of the investigator-driven proposals, or grants actually, are at both the senior and the junior level, are nanotechnology. And also in the Marie Curie programme, but there are spillovers into health, information technology, particularly energy, environment and transport. Theme 4, Nanosciences, Nanotechnologies, Materials and Production, NMP, is the lead programme for nanotechnology within the European Commission, within the European Union, and heads interdisciplinary service committees within the Commission. Now, these are processes for planning. We have a strategic planning process and an annual operating process. At the start of the programme, the Commission took information from European technology platforms. These are 36 large clusters of industries that formulate roadmaps and their view of where their technology and industrial needs are going. There are other areas of information for gathering. I chair the expert advisory group for the NMP programme, and our role was to work with the Commission to develop the initial plan. We've recently carried out the mid-term review. It's a little bit like midstream modulation in the sense there. And we're now working on the preparation for Framework Programme 8, which will start in 2013. This is then, so we in fact, just over a year ago, published our report of our midstream modulation. This is then worked upon by the Commission and through the Member States Programme Committee produce annual implementation plans for each year. And it publishes a work programme, something like that. And the Commission is now actually working on the programme of calls for July of this year. So the interesting thing is I was a member of the expert advisory group in Framework 6, and in Framework 6, very early on, a group of us, sort of a little bit iconoclastically, really pushed forward the idea of responsible management of, particularly of nanotechnologies. We were worried about the GMO thing like everybody else were, but some of us had some knowledge of nanotechnology and what the risks and possibilities might be. So the difference between us, I think, and the Royal Society report, which came out at the same time as ours, we had an action plan, which I'm pleased to say the Commission took and turned into something very, very useful, as you will see. In the UK, we had a Royal Society and a Royal Academy of Engineering report, which the government did nothing about. And it took several years for some drip feeding of small amounts of cash. So thank goodness for Europe, I say. Okay. Now I'm going to move away a little bit from that and talk about something that we have discovered through the collaboration between myself, Professor Richard Thorpe in Paul's Centre, and a research colleague of mine, Dr. Kirsto Panzer. So the research done by Richard through the British Academy of Management shows management research and training has declined in Europe's business schools in the last 10 years. Professors tend to be over 50 years of age, and many will soon be retiring. This we see as a strategic gap. My cartoon, which some of you at the back might struggle to read, illustrates possibly why this has happened. Like many other parts, the City of London, politicians, the belief that the banking and financing sector had the magic touch. So an awful lot of business schools migrated their efforts into there and away from industry, dirty old industry and management. So that's given us a potential threat and an opportunity. And collectively, between our institute and Richard Thorpe's institute, we've developed a sort of our own little roadmap of where we need to focus our research. We have a perspective looking through on strategic management, technology innovation, managerial and entrepreneurial agency, and looking at the individual agent level, the company level and the innovation system level. And we think that this is a very fertile area which we can build on. And recently, about a year ago, we secured a €5 million Marie Curie initial training network to study this in a lot more detail. And there is a website on there which you go to and get the details. Now, turning my attention back to the health and safety and environmental issues, I won't go through this in detail, but these are some of the mechanisms that nanoparticles could get into various organs in the body, where they may or may not do DNA damage, and they may or may not cause immunotoxicity problems or inflammatory problems. And then we have a similar scheme, of course, for the environmental area. Okay. So this is an area that needs to be added to our management research portfolio. Moving swiftly on. This is a sort of top-level view of where EU Framework 7 research funds have been going in the last 5 years. We have something like €100 million worth of research invested in collaborative research projects. These projects fall in two categories, below €4 million and above €4 million. The ones above €4 million tend to be around €10 million in size, with quite large numbers of partners. So we look at risk assessment and some techniques for carrying out those hazard assessments, monitoring, instruments for hazard monitoring. Communication is an issue, transparent dialogue and risk perception. In terms of proactive management, mitigating risk and designing safe nanoparticles. And this is particularly important, of course, if you're using them in theranostic applications to deliver new types of drugs. Maybe we can use some of those concepts to design safe drugs, to design safe nanomaterials for commercial applications. And lastly, cost control. LCA stands for life cycle analysis in our jargon. There is a difference between US policy and European policy. We put all our money into quite large pan-European consortia. The US has been some focusing of quite good sums of money in at least 3 centres at Rice, Duke and UCLA. So our approaches are quite different, and I think they're quite complementary. You're doing things here that we're not doing in Europe, which we may have to learn from. But maybe there are some things we can do that we've developed in our collaborative research programs that would be of some interest and benefit here. Arriving at consensus on ethical issues is quite a complex process because of multiple stakeholders. There is some jargon up there. Ultimately, standardization and regulation is going to be important. The top left, ISO TC 229, is an international standards technical committee, 229, which specializes in standardization of nanomaterials. And it's headed up by a British guy. So Europeans have a strong role in there, as do the US, and increasingly so do the Chinese. But before you can get anywhere, you need to come down onto the bottom left-hand corner, metrology, and develop the science for measuring the materials. You need many different kinds of measurement approaches, from basic physical, chemical, biological, through to toxicological, and so on. Going over the top right, REACH is Europe's way of regulating chemicals. It's registration, evaluation, authorization of chemicals for safe use. And then all of these things have to arrive at some kind of consensus. The problem is this can be quite slow, and without arriving at consensus, informing the citizens has been quite an issue, and I think we've seen elements there on both sides of the Atlantic. But there are ways and means we can accelerate that process. If we can, standardization can usually take a decade or more to come to a consensus. We have to move much faster than that and have some interim arrangements so that we can engage with our citizens more effectively. Okay, not a lot of good published work on these things. There's a UNESCO report from 2006. And the European Commission published its nanomedicine report in 2007. So there's still a lot to go at here. So in summary, US and EU are Nanotechnology public expenditure is quite huge. It's about 1.8 billion a year here and 1.9 billion euros per year in Europe, of which 2/3 is by the member states, 1/3 by the European Commission. Investment in management, science and training for these technologies is small and declining. So we're investing a lot of money to get a lot of nanotechnology, and we're not putting any money into entrepreneurs and innovators to make it all happen. Bit of a gap, I think. Okay, we're both sides of the Atlantic, we've made substantial investment in nanosafety research, but consensus is a little way off. We're beginning to see through some of our clusters some examples of good, usable results coming through, but we do need to communicate that much more effectively with industry and government and with industry. Industry and government, I detect, are quite impatient for clarity. We're spending all this money on you guys in nanotech. When are you going to tell us it's safe? If you can't tell us it's safe, should we continue to invest in it? So there is a major, major need for responsible management, research and training to deliver the promise of EU and US nanotech investments. So I will stop and thank you for listening. Hope you could hear me through my sort of cold, affected voice, and pass over to Paul to come down to see what it's like on the ground to put in practice some of these ideas.
Okay, let me start by trying to make a connection then between some of this policy discourse and so as Dan mentioned earlier on, one of the things that we were mindful of and wanting to understand was the extent to which the labs we were in were aware of these sort of policy mandates and how they were responding to them. So let me just start with, so it was a UK lab that I was in, so here's some very briefly, some UK policy context. I'll cover this very briefly because Robert mentioned some of it. So Her Majesty's Government innovation policy as it's developed over the last 10 years has had an important consistent theme that universities are important. And the way that has manifested itself, or the narrative that has developed, is that university professors and researchers, their role is not simply to do good research and then throw it over the wall for someone else to pick up and run with, that they must actively participate on connecting the results of that research to user communities. I'm not sure how that's going to be done. They've got that challenge as well. So this has become known as the impact agenda, and it's a big talking point in the academy generally in the UK at the moment. The phrase responsible innovation has only rarely appeared, to my knowledge, in the UK. It first appeared in a funding call from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council about 18 months ago. It was a geoengineering call in which a particular part of the proposal that was expected was that the scientists would produce a statement or a narrative of how their proposal could be understood as being responsible. And they were given very little guidance as to how that was meant, because it was something of an experiment, actually. A colleague, Richard Owen, at University of Westminster, actually collated and studied their responses, and he's helping inform the EPSRC's understanding of this issue right now. And then just this month, the Technology Strategy Board, which is a department of government that connects innovation in research to industry, issued a funding call in which they also used this term. And for them, it seemed to be associated with toxicology. Okay, so there's some policy context there. So we're getting to my lab very briefly. Here's some words that characterises them. The lab I'm going to talk about is the one on the left of that column that I have called Colco. And it's a colloidal science lab. It's a fairly traditional university lab, well regarded in academic terms, but also very well regarded by industrialists, a substantial amount of industrial funding. And we were interested in it because we thought we'd see some interesting things there, because they were actively engaging in commercialisation activities as one means of connecting with the wider economy and society. So it seemed an interesting context for us. Okay, so as I get into the lab, one of the things I was interested in the first instance was the extent to which they were aware of some of these mandates. And here's some quotes from the senior postdoc who runs the group. And he started off by saying to me that these ethical issues weren't really present for them. It's not something that they were mindful of on a day-to-day basis. What they were conscious of was the issue of the toxicology of the materials with which they dealt. So they seemed to have a greater awareness of the upstream part, the downstream part of the innovation process, rather than the upstream part. And the reasons for that was they were connected with these spin-out groups and industrial companies, I think. Now, in relation to the rationale behind specific funding calls and their knowledge of the upstream process of policy development behind that, that was fairly opaque to them. You can see he says there, he assumes there's something behind it that the public wants, and it's a complicated chain, probably, but they don't really understand that. It was the downstream that perhaps they understand a bit more. But what I also detected really from the outset was a great appetite and an openness to engage in this sort of activity. You know, that was absolutely clear in the reception that I got, and you see it in his final quote at the bottom here. There was something in this, they weren't quite certain what it was, but they were prepared to give this a go. So that seemed to be a pretty good start. So what I would like to do, because I've got no one to respond to this, was just to give you a couple of stories, really. Give you my perspective on a couple of stories. So one of the guys that I followed was doing a project connected with dishwasher tablets. So there's nanotechnology in dishwasher tablets, has been for quite a while. We've not known it, but we know it now. They'd got this collaboration with a giant transnational corporation, who shall remain nameless, but who is very powerful in this area, and has a strong reputation for being highly ethical, actually. They were interested in getting an edge over their competitors, so they'd initiated this project exploring these dishwasher tablets and trying to understand what was really happening in them, what was the mechanism of cleaning in order that they might get a better tablet. So they were doing a lot of research themselves using dishwashers and tablets and spaghetti bolognese encrusted plates, and they were doing that. But they were also interacting with 3 university groups. Colco, the one at the light top, the light colour at the top there, they were charged with understanding the surface science. So what happens when these nanoparticles touch the plates and the cutlery? So understanding those surface interactions. There was a group studying, doing ab initio calculations, studying the modelling of these sort of interactions on the nanoscale. And then at another university, there was a toxicology group. And the way, looking at the toxicology of these particles, and the way the project was structured was at the centre there was this transnational corporation, and they were interacting with each of these 3 groups. But the 3 groups themselves were fairly opaque to each other. The two here had some sort of connection, I'm trying to represent by a dashed line, simply because they were in the same university. So just along the corridor from where I was the folks doing the computer modelling. But these guys in green were at the other end of the country, and the folks here had no notion of what was coming out of that. And when we explored this through the mid-mod tool, they kind of, well, what emerged was they trusted the company in the middle. So if something meaningful had come up that they ought to know about, you know, they would get told. But it was a very bounded project in a sense. And what was clear from where they spoke about it was some of the things that emerged for us was that the space of interest of Colco, of the surface science group, were apparently very constrained. But they'd created a virtue of this because it was constrained in an interesting landscape. Better to be constrained exploring complex, messy, interesting materials than be open in a system where the only materials you have access to are model systems. I mean, if I see another AFM study on gold systems, I'll scream, really. So it was constrained, but it was constrained in an interesting landscape. All the management effort around here was geared towards managing the uncertainty of where this was going. That was clear. And there's a kind of co-responsibility happening. There's an innovation division of labour going on here. But it seemed to me, it seemed to us, a very kind of imperfect co-responsibility, because the communication lines between these different groups were very limited. So anyway, so this was the one of the projects on which we focused, and we used the mid-mod tool. Now let me just give offer some reflections then on the steering engagement then. I think the first thing to say is, in my hands, and so I'm owning up, this could be me as well, I thought there was some limitations to the kind of mid-mod tool. I say that could be me. Some other things it could be is that the time scale is simply short, and 12 weeks is a short period of time. And I'll have some more to say about that in my final story. And the other thing that struck me, this was comparing the two case studies actually, was the decision timeframes can differ between sciences. So there were quite a lot of decisions in this case. In my other case, where it was the core technology was electron microscopy, in my 12 weeks there were mainly only 2 or 3 substantive decisions that they took. Because having taken a decision, it could take weeks to set up this fancy microscope, it could take weeks to collect data, and it could take even longer time to analyse it. So there's something about context that's really important in using the tool. Having said that, I was very conscious of the fact that they in both case settings, they actively tried to use me. People, as I heard yesterday, people have a view on what you do if you come from a business school, and they weren't far wrong, I suppose. So each of these things here, and these 4 bullet points, were things I was approached and asked to do. In each of them, my mode of engagement was not to preach or give them the benefit of my knowledge, but rather to initiate a conversation. So I'll just take one of them for purposes of time. So they asked me about how should we organise ourselves in the lab. So rather than tell them how I felt they should organise themselves in the lab, I facilitated a group conversation. I introduced them to some of the creativity literature, gave them some language to understand creative behaviours, creative attitudes, and then we had a conversation, a group conversation, about the extent to which they felt they displayed those attitudes or they displayed those behaviours. And we just had a conversation. And although there were actions that could have come out of it, I deliberately avoided doing the management thing of, what's the actions and who's going to own it and what time is it going to be. But what happened actually after that, off their own bat, and I found the next day when they're in the lab, is they reorganised the space they'd got. They're actually very cramped in the lab. They didn't have much space to work with, but they actually reorganised things in a very straightforward way so that where they made the tea and the coffee, they changed the orientation. And now, when they made tea and the coffee, they couldn't help but bump into each other and interact informally. So that was one example, and there were a number of others where they tried to use me because I was there, and they were grateful of it. There were also, in addition to that, there were hints I got of their curiosity about other sciences, not other natural sciences, other social sciences, the humanities. And this is one instance here that gnaws at me, because I wish I'd made more of this. This was followed from my initial presentation to the group. So I had 5 minutes at a research group meeting, which I was explaining myself. One of the things I thought I had to do was justify why what I was doing deserved to be called research. And so I suggested to them that there were different ways in which we might gain knowledge of the world. And on the one hand, there's something that we might label the scientific method or positivism, and on maybe another extreme there's something that we might label social constructionism or interpretivism or some word like that. And I suggested how these things might be different if we looked at, there's some dimensions. I think I had the role of the researcher, the purpose of the search, the analytical mode. I might have had a number of dimensions and just indicated how these epistemologies differed. And there was a flip chart there, and I just very kind of scrolled this out very quickly, just to try and give a sense that there are different ways in which we might get knowledge of the world that they might not get exposed to. The next day when I was in the lab, they'd taken off my flip chart and pinned it up on the wall. And I said, why have you done that? And he said, we've never had this philosophy of science, and it seems quite interesting. We thought if we put it there, it might just remind us there's other ways. You know, they're not going to turn into social constructionists, but they're just mindful there was something else. And I wish I'd followed that up, but I didn't. Let me finish with one story that might be a critical incident, might be, but happened after the 12 weeks, okay? Because these guys were just down the road from me, so I had an ongoing relationship for a period of time. And this is something I heard about after the 12 weeks. So what happened was this. The dishwasher studies had concentrated on the wet cycle, so what happens when water's present. And what they'd found, regardless of what they studied, was that the nanoparticles did not stick to anything, to any sort of cutlery, to any sort of plate, of any sort of material, when water was present. Just didn't stick. The industrial, and they did this for 2.25 years, the industrial partner at this stage stopped their active interest in the project and their focus went somewhere else. So there's 9 months still to go. So the postdoc doing this can now do what he wants. And it seemed to me this was a real interesting decision. Those constraints haven't completely gone because there's a genealogy behind this relationship, so they've not completely vanished, but they've been taken down, the barrier's been taken down. He can do almost anything as long as he doesn't spoil the relationship. So what does he choose to do? Now, the thing he chose to do was to study the dry cycle. Now, maybe that's kind of obvious. The wet cycle had not worked. The dry cycle, well, let's have a look there. So this is what happens when the plates are drying. What's the status of the nanoparticles on the plates or the cutlery when they have dried? And what he found was that the nanoparticles build up and accumulate on the plates. Now, why might that be interesting? We explored. Now, it suggests other applications. Another part of the group had an interest in inks. So there's a potential application in how inks dry. And when they've written up this research, that is the application to which the research paper speaks. So that's one obvious one. There's a novelty science. Would you know there's a physics in the creation of coffee stains, in how they're produced. Very interesting, important physics, if little known. And so they could maybe speak to that. They were aware of that physics. But interestingly as well, is if humans are going to come into contact with these nanoparticles, then the nanoparticles have got to be loosely stuck, as they now appear to be, to the plates or the cutlery. So the food touches the plates, the food goes in our mouth, we get into contact with the nanoparticles. So all of a sudden, there's a health impact behind this. And he was conscious of this, I think, in his choice. I mean, all I would say, and I will leave you to, I'm not clear on how to connect this to the kind of the mid-mod tool. To be honest, I'm not completely satisfied what I've got evidence for here. But what I can say is we discussed during our 12 weeks the lack of dry cycle studies during those mid-mod conversations. So it seems to me, if nothing else, there's a very interesting decision point here, however he came to it. Okay, final slide, then I'm done. Where are we now in Leeds with this sort of engagement and what's our sort of ongoing contribution that we hope to make to the network that CNS are creating? So let me start off with a few just statements of values, first of all. It's my belief quite strongly that no one has the high ground when it comes to how to do science-led innovation. I've encountered in my professional life a number of people who think they do, who think they can see further and clearer than anyone else, but I'm not satisfied that they're correct. It has been my experience that valid knowledge about how you do this sort of innovation is held by all actors. And crucially, that knowledge evolves through interaction. It becomes refigured through interaction. It becomes contextualized, and it becomes useful through interaction. Innovation of all types is a contact sport. So those would be our values. We're trying to explore this now in a number of other projects, some of which Thierry alluded to. And interestingly, we're trying to take it into different venues. As well as the lab, we're trying to move it into as well as university labs, we're trying to move it into industrial labs, and we're also trying to move it into clinical settings. And I think it's in that regard in which we'd like to try and make a contribution to the ongoing development of this initiative. And one final thing, definitely my way of saying thank you to Eric for the invitation, and thank you to my colleagues. On a very personal level, the interdisciplinarity that we've been talking about in these last couple of days is the interdisciplinarity that exists between the social and human sciences and natural sciences. But actually, there's another kind of hidden interdisciplinarity that's been evident through this programme, and that's where my significant learning has been. And that has been the interdisciplinarity between scholars from different human sciences. And so exposure to those and to these guys has been a significant learning for me and really enriched the experience. So I thank them, and I thank Eric for the opportunity, and I thank you for listening.
Maybe a couple questions? Back there in the corner.
I have a question for Paul. So I'm interested in the ambiguity that you discover over the co-responsibility model. So I'm wondering if it is possible that different parties in your diagram perceive themselves as responsible to different parties or stakeholders, or do they have a shared common understanding of what so-called responsibility entails in this context? And furthering that line of thought, so at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that the notion of RI was just introduced to Britain very recently, right? To a geoengineering proposal call or something. So I'm wondering if this equivocation, is it just a matter of ethnographic invention that stays at the downstream level, or does it go all the way to the upstream level? I mean, does the policymaker in Britain or in a general sense have a common understanding of what responsible innovation means? Because when you use that term responsible innovation, it assumes that somebody is responsible to someone, okay, in doing something. So, and it seems to me that there is a spectrum of actors and networks of processes involved in this whole process. So I'm just wondering what you think about it. Thank you.
Okay. On the in regards to that project specifically, they absolutely didn't have a shared understanding of kind of where responsibilities lay. I think once we tried to dig beneath the surface, there was a very simple, as can often be the case with management, there was a very simple and straightforward and easily visible expression of the division of labour, which was a kind of scientific division of labour. So those three research groups on the periphery, I think, if you'd have asked them, certainly if you asked the guys in Colcode, their responsibility was to do the best science that they could, and that was it. It was for the transnational corporation to bring it all together. That's what their responsibility was. However, if we see how events unfolded, then or how events unfolded, I think, illustrate this. I think they have part of their responsibility is to try and make other contributions as well, because they're not just scientific automata, doing excellent science and that's it, and it's bounded. They're thinking people as well. So the guy at the end, when he's left to do what he wants, he doesn't do more wet work. He could have done. He does something else, and he was acutely aware that if humans were going to come into contact with this material, it was irrelevant what happened in the wet cycle. It's what happened when the plate comes out the dishwasher, not what's happening when it's in. So that was it. That was an example of a contribution he could make. Now, I also felt that he shouldn't be content. Part of being responsible should have meant that they shouldn't have been content with trusting the transnational corporation to tell them if something of toxicological interest came up. They should have been interested in that project as well. That would be part of being a responsible partner, being interested in what other people are doing. You can be interested without interfering. So this was what I meant by kind of imperfect co-responsibility. There were other opportunities to extend their contribution, and I felt they had a responsibility to do that. And that's actually the tenet of government policy. Actually, I think that's what they're meaning with this impact agenda. On the question of the use of the word responsible innovation in the UK, I mean, the thing that I didn't cover was that there's been a lot of studies. Brian Wynn's been involved in some. The Royal Academy of Engineering have commissioned some well-known think tanks in the UK, like Demos, have been involved in the whole area that's perhaps characterised as the public engagement with science. That it was initiated out of the way genetically modified technologies appeared in Europe in the 1990s. So there was a lot of discourse around responsible innovation. It just didn't get that label, or it didn't get that name. I'm not sure whether that's significant or not. I mean, I think it's all pointing in the same direction, to be honest, whether they use the same label.
I can add something about that technology strategy board aspect there. Paul is right that there is this interesting history. The strategy board is playing things a little bit sensibly, I think, and carefully. It's issued its first set of calls to interdisciplinary teams involving social scientists to perhaps define those kind of things more precisely. One of the things I'm going to do when I go back home is talk to Professor Chris Magone in our ethics centre to make a submission for a proposal to go. The first round of proposals are very much of a consultancy basis to define the territory for a better scoped out set of much bigger calls for collaborative research.
Well, we're running way behind, and I'm the speaker who's going to be hurt the most, so I have a conflict of interest, but I think we'll leave it at that for questions.